Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see such a nice crowd here on the Clark's second annual, hopefully of many annuals to come, Artist Books Weekend. My name is Terry Bocha. I'm the Collections Development Librarian for the Clark. And for those of you who don't know, the Clark has one of the great visual resources and visual studies libraries in the country. We have about 300,000 volumes in the general collection, and of the 300,000 volumes, we have about 6,000 volumes in our artists' book collection, and you'll hear more about that shortly. As we were thinking about what our topic should be for our keynote speaker for this annual event this year, I had just purchased this really interesting book that just sort of fell across my lap called The Collaborative Artist's Book, Evolving Ideas in Contemporary Poetry and Art. I looked through it. It was really a very fascinating topic, and it gave me a chance to then buy several of the artist books that were mentioned for our artist book collection. So as we were thinking about who to invite to give the final to be our speaker today, we thought, well, why don't we see if this wonderful scholar would be willing to join us. And I'm happy to say that Dr. Alexandra J. Gold was not only willing, but actually enthusiastic about joining us today. So very shortly, I'll ask Dr. Gold to come up to the podium and share her knowledge on poetry and artists and their wonderful collaboration in making these artist books. But first, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Alexandra. She has a Ph.D. in English from Boston University. She's a very talented author and poet in her own right, and she's a lecturer at the Harvard Writing Program. So I think you've heard enough from me right now. Dr. Gold, would you care to step up to the podium?
Thank you, Terry, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I am so grateful to the Clark Museum for the generous invitation to speak, and I owe particular thanks to Rachel Cruz, who has been delightful to work with in the months leading up to this event. I am so thrilled to be here with you to share my thoughts and insights about artist books, a subject I have been studying for nearly a decade through my doctoral dissertation and first book. My talk today will do a few things. First, I'll share a bit about my own background with the artist book form, as well as a brief history of the genre itself. Then, we'll turn to take a closer look at one of the artist books I detail in my own work, Robert Creeley and Robert Indiana's 1968 collaboration, Numbers. We're also fortunate to be joined today by a wonderful performance artist, Jazmin, who will be reading Creeley's poems a little bit later. As you've just heard, my name is Alexandra Gold, and I'm an instructor and researcher at Harvard University, where I teach in the first-year writing program. Before I began at Harvard, I earned my Ph.D. in English at Boston University, and it was while I was at BU that I first became interested in artist books, and like so much good research across disciplines, my introduction to artist books arose by happenstance. As a literary scholar by training, my introduction to artist books came first through poetry, and specifically my field of post-1945 American avant-garde poetry. Early in my graduate school journey, I was fortunate to take a course on postmodern art, where my professor suggested that I might look deeper into the connections between contemporary poetry and visual art. It was at her suggestion that I discovered the rich history of collaborative friendships and work that in many ways came to define the avant-garde literary and artistic sensibility of the post-World War II era. I soon became particularly enamored with the work of the experimental poets Frank O'Hara and Robert Creeley, whose relationships to and collaborations with visual artists were especially important to their careers. Not only are they considered two of the most influential poets of the post-war period, but they also completed more collaborative work with visual artists than any other poets of their generation, at least 50 projects between them. Both O'Hara and Creeley had been deeply inspired by abstract expressionism early on in their careers, and their interest in art profoundly shaped their poetry in turn. Exploring O'Hara and Creeley's deep connections to the art world subsequently became the focus of my dissertation work, and it was during my research for that project that I happened upon their artist books and became increasingly fascinated with the artist book as a form in itself. And I was delighted to discover just how many poets in O'Hara and Creeley circles, as well as in the subsequent generations of poets that they had inspired, had been producing artist books of all kinds, a discovery that became the impetus for my first book project. And I know some of them are actually on display out in the hallway as well. Published by the University of Iowa Press as part of their Contemporary North American Poetry series in the summer of 2023, my book, entitled The Collaborative Artist Book, Evolving Ideas in Poetry, in Contemporary Poetry and Art, centers on 5 poet-artist collaborations in book form. In addition to Frank O'Hara and Michael Goldberg's odes, and my subject today, Robert Creeley and Robert Indiana's numbers, which were created in the late 1950s and 60s, my book looks at 3 additional case studies from a subsequent generation of poets and artists, mostly working in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. These include Anne Waldman and George Schneeman's Homage to Alan G., which was written soon after the death of the artist's friend, the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Erica Hunt and Allison Sarr's Arcade, and Maybe Bursenbrugge and Kiki Smith's Concordance, both of which were published in trade edition by a Berkeley-based small press, Kelsey Street, that specializes in collaborations between women artists. And I've included some images of the covers there for you to look at. The goal of my book was twofold. First, I wanted to devote a full-length study to artist books because what I had found in my research was that little concerted attention had been paid to artist books in literary studies and poetry studies in particular. You might be able to find maybe a one-off article or book chapter, but there wasn't really a book that sort of took the collaborative artist book as a genre in its own right. That's likely because these works can pose issues of access and interest. Because they are interdisciplinary in nature, they tend to fall through the cracks between art history and literature, and academic studies are well known for clinging to their respective disciplinary silos. In addition, most of these works, as here, currently reside in museum and special collections archives, so they are not always readily accessible to scholars who want to study them. My second goal with the book was that I wanted to reflect on what these artist book forms might contribute to our understanding of contemporary poetry and art writ large. For what I had come to recognize during the earliest stages of my research was that viewing poems in the context of an artist book proffered an extremely different experience of the work than viewing them in more traditional settings like anthologies or collected poems, where they were subsequently reprinted and where most of us as scholars and casual readers alike are most likely to encounter them. So I wanted to begin by showing you an example from Frank O'Hara and Michael Goldberg's odes. On the left, over here, you'll find a picture of the poem Ode on Necrophilia by Frank O'Hara as it appears in the collected poems of Frank O'Hara from 1973. And on the right, you'll see an image of the same Ode on Necrophilia as it appears in the original artist book odes with Goldberg's print from 1960. The difference is striking, and I was eager to explore what that difference might reveal. On the most basic level, we can see how, in the collected works, we encounter the poem without any mention or sense that it was originally attached to Goldberg's screen print. That's not to suggest, of course, that you can't have a real and rich experience of the poem if you only encounter it in the collected works, but that it can ultimately change our experience or understanding of the work when we attach it to the print. In the case of odes, for instance, there's a particularly important dimension to the poem that I think Goldberg's print helps bring out. Throughout odes, O'Hara is thinking deeply about death. The earliest poem in the series is about Jackson Pollock's death, and many of his poems, including the Ode of Necrophilia, as the title implies, are dealing in some way with this theme. This is clearly something Goldberg himself was attentive to, as we can see in the bottom third of the painting, the subtle but unmistakable word die scrawled diagonally in black ink, and you can see it sort of right there. More important, a very omnipresent threat or specter of death would have also held a special salience for O'Hara, who was a gay man living in a repressive McCarthyist 1950s, where queer men could be punished or worse, for open displays of sexuality and for charges of alleged disloyalty. And indeed, the threat of death, as well as complicated questions about patriotism and loyalty and allegiance to one's country, were topics of conversation among his circle of artists and friends. And so, the red, white, and blue color screen print that Goldberg creates here seems to situate O'Hara's poem within a clearly and distinctly American framework, making overt some of these subtler, more allegorical dynamics in this poem that might otherwise remain implicit. In short, by presenting this very American framework for the poem through Goldberg's prints, some of O'Hara's musings on death, even in a sort of sardonic poem like Ode on Necrophilia, which is devoted to love of dead men, takes on a slightly more urgent and more distinct personal valence. And we'll see shortly how there's something very similar at play, I think, in Creeley and Indiana's Numbers, where the immediate conversation between the poems and prints brings out a different dimension of the works themselves. But I like to start with this example because I think it's particularly visually striking, right, when we see the difference between them. Ultimately, one of my aims in writing on artist books, and one of my aims here today, is to make the case that when artists and poets collaborate in artist book form, we get a much more dynamic sense of the works that's worth attending to. For more than visual art or poetry alone, collaborative artist books are uniquely intermedial, intersubjective, and interactive forms. Collaborative artist books are forms of betweenness. They animate the creative possibilities that emerge between media. They ask us to think about the relationships between the arts and cross-pollination among them, as they subvert the limitations of any one medium on their own. They also ask us to think more deeply about intersubjectivity, because they are forms produced not by singular artists, but by multiple collaborators, including the artists, the bookmakers, typesetters, printers, translators, and whoever else might be involved in their creation. Consequently, they challenge a widely held myth about the heroic individual artist that has a long-standing history. We tend to think of artists sort of huddled away, right, tortured poets in their own little enclaves, and I think these collaborative artist books, because they are social and collaborative forms, help us or give lie to that myth a little bit. Finally, they are highly interactive forms. Because they are at once visual, spatial, textual material, they require many simultaneous forms of attention. They're multi-dimensional artworks that are meant to be held, touched, read, and reread, which is a very different experience of art objects than we're accustomed to. Unlike paintings that are hung on a wall, from which the viewer is expected to maintain some respectful distance, artist books are very much tactile forms. They entreat audience participation. We'll return to some of these ideas later when we look more closely at Creeley and Indiana's work, but before we get there, I want to turn now to offer a brief history of the artist book form itself. And I want to start with a quote from one of the preeminent book scholars and artists, Joanna Drucker, to whom much of my own thinking is indebted. Drucker notes that, quote, "In many ways it could be argued that the artist book is the quintessential 20th century art form. Artist books appear in every major movement in art and literature and have provided a unique means of realizing works within all the many avant-garde, experimental, and independent groups whose contributions have defined the shape of the 20th century artistic activity." And I've just included one example there. The accordion format that you're seeing here is a very common form that artist books will take, especially in sort of the late 1960s and 1970s, and so I wanted to show an example of that. But crucially, the artist book did not emerge in a vacuum in the 20th century. Although, as Drucker notes, artist books have a particularly robust history in that period, they have important antecedents in earlier texts that combined art and poetry or art and text. In a slightly more modern period, one of the earliest and most often cited antecedents for artist books is William Blake's illuminated printings. Blake was an 18th century English poet and painter who published his poems with vivid drawings, as we see here in his Songs of Innocence and Experience and the poem The Tiger, and whose work is consequently considered one of the most important forerunners to the sorts of collaborative contemporary artist books I'm very interested in today. And we can see that in the case of William Blake's work, the drawings and relationship between the drawings and the text was very literal. His poem is about the tiger, and he illustrates a tiger, but we don't always see that very direct or sort of literal interpretation in later books. Following Blake, the next two major periods where we see artist books really start to flourish are first in interwar Europe, particularly among avant-garde circles like the French Surrealist and Symbolist and the Russian Futurists, and second, in the 1960s in the US among minimalist and conceptualist artists like Ed Ruscha, Sol LeWitt, and Dieter Roh. And it is at this juncture in the 20th century where an interesting schism in some artist book scholarship emerges. There are some scholars today who insist on drawing fine line distinctions between different subsets of artist books, and who particularly wish to distinguish what we would call livre d'artiste, or what are sometimes called fine press books, or livre deluxe, from what we would call artist books. And the distinctions that they draw fall roughly into two subcategories, separating fine art objects from mass-produced objects, and separating seemingly highbrow forms from lowbrow ones, or elite forms from sort of democratic forms. And I've sort of charted the differences that some people see in these books. As I said, livre d'artistes were very popular in interwar Europe among these avant-garde circles. They tended to be handmade, collaborative, commissioned by fine presses. They were made in limited edition, so there are only a few copies, and as a consequence, they were rather expensive works. They tended to incorporate both art and text, especially poetry and painting. And artist books, by contrast, were sort of the newer forms that became popular in the US in the 1960s among conceptual artists. They were closely aligned with what's been called the democratic multiple, and you could probably guess from the term that they were made to be widely distributed. They were made to be read and produced cheaply and quickly using technology like screen printing and Xerox. They were very individualistic or sort of do-it-yourself. The artist could create them and distribute them. And they tended to be photography or print-based with sort of minimal text. So these are some of the distinctions that people have made between these two separate categories of work, and I'll show you some examples. But one of the things I've found in the books that I've studied in my own work, and many others I've been fortunate to access over the course of my research, is that most artist books actually undermine these clear-cut distinctions in practice. And I'm not the only person to have made this case. Many people have sort of showed that as much as we'd like to see these as different categories, they're really all sort of artist books. Of course, the irony also being that livre d'artiste means artist book as well, so it's sort of hard to draw these distinctions. Nevertheless, I wanted to sketch these out because it does give us some crucial insight into how the form has been continually evolving even within the 20th century and continues to do so today. So I have just two examples. The first is Henri Matisse and Stéphane Mallarmé's Poésies from 1932, and this is what some people would refer to as a sort of livre d'artiste. We can see some of the major qualities, the handmade drawings, the collaboration between poetry and art. It's a very polished form, was commissioned by a press, and so sort of embodies this idea of the sort of older livre d'artistes that were popular in interwar Europe. And then on the next slide, we have Ed Ruscha's 26 Gasoline Stations from 1963, which many people consider the first artist book, if we're, again, making these clear-cut distinctions. And you can see, hopefully, some of the differences between the form. Here we have photography and very minimal text. It's really just captions that he's added. He's gone throughout the country, taken photographs of 26 gasoline stations, told us where they are, but it has much more of a sort of do-it-yourself ethos where one person could go out with a camera and create this book, right? So those are sort of some of the differences between the two forms. But as I said, many scholars have moved away from trying to categorize these as separate categories and have sort of just viewed them all as artist books. And indeed, though, as I said, there are some scholars who continue to insist on these distinctions. The critical consensus today seems to have moved to thinking about all of these works as artist books, no matter what they look like or what method or period informed their creation. As artist book scholar Karen Elliott notes in her work on 21st century forms, artist book is now considered the dominant term and incorporates the many subgenres and distinct categories that make it up. And I believe this definition makes sense because it is the most generous definition of artist book as sort of any work of art in book form. Most important, I think the real beauty of the artist book form, construed in the broadest sense, is that the genre is diverse and capacious enough to accommodate a wide range of works in many sizes and many shapes and by many different artists. including those who have been historically marginalized from the mainstream art canon: women artists, queer artists, artists of color, all of whom have made vital contributions to the artist book larger history. In fact, I had the good fortune during my research to do a residency at the Smithsonian, where I got to work with their enormous artist book collection. And I think that collection really highlights the form's vast range, and I've included some examples here so you can just see how diverse artist books really are. They incorporate everything from sort of more sculptural works, as we find in Julie Chen and Barb Tenenbaum's Glimpse, collaborative works like the ones I'm studying here, as well as Klotz and Jeffrey Powers' Everything's the Same, conceptualist works like Solowitz, Geometric Figures in Color, and books that bear more of a resemblance to the older livre d'artiste form like Claire Moore's Half and Half from 1983. Viewing this range of works and offering you a brief glimpse of them today, I think helps us understand that the form really is quite wide-ranging, and that artist books can really accommodate all of these different forms. And I wanted to sketch this brief history out too so that we could potentially locate Creeley and Indiana's book a little bit more squarely within it. So I want to turn our attention now more directly to that particular work. Despite the debates about how one might properly define an artist book in the contemporary era, there's no doubt that the period after World War II witnessed a tremendous uptick in the creation of artist books among experimental artists and poets of all stripes. And there are a few factors in particular that led to that resurgence. First, European influence. Just before and in the early stages of World War II, numerous European intellectuals and artists fled to America to escape the perils of Nazi Germany. Some of those who came to America at that time were skilled artisans who introduced poets and artists to new printmaking techniques and technologies like screen printing and silk printing. For instance, Frank O'Hara worked on his book with Floriano Vecchi, an Italian master screen printer, who introduced numerous mid-century artists to the form, including Andy Warhol, who would become known for his work in the medium. And I've included a picture of Warhol in the top corner. Screen printing is a process by which the artist sort of applies paint to the canvas and then sort of pushes a screen over it, as you can sort of see in that picture. In addition, some of these artists who came over from Europe founded small presses that would specialize in print work. One of them was Tatiana Grossman, who founded the well-known Universal Limited Art Editions, which would publish print work by some of the leading artists of the day, including Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and others. The second reason why we see an explosion of artist books after mid-century had to do with the artists' and poets' rebellion against formalism, or the idea that form or medium would be the sort of end-all be-all of art. In 1940, Clement Greenberg, a well-known art critic, wrote a now infamous essay in which he made the case that the medium should be strictly defined and divided. Painting was painting, poetry was poetry, and any painting or poem should really strive to embody its own formal qualities. He was an early champion of abstract expressionism and saw in that model an ideal vision of what he admired in art. To him, abstract expressionism was sort of the purest expression of painting as a medium, and sort of dependent on nothing but the art itself, or but the paint itself. And although poets like O'Hara and Creeley greatly admired abstract expressionism, they had a very different idea and much less formal understanding of medium. Instead, they wanted to experiment, thinking about how drawing inspiration from art forms beyond poetry, especially visual art, might expand the possibilities for their own work and make it more experimental. And so they, and many poets like them, found in artists' books a vehicle primed for such experimentation and collaboration. The final reason was that these poets and artists were driven to create artist books in the post-war period because of their own desire to be sort of anti-establishment. Much as they rejected received critical ideas about formalism, they also rejected perceived ideas about what poetry should be. Both O'Hara and Creeley had attended Harvard and often bristled at what they felt was the outdated poetry of their curricula. This was something they shared with their respective circles, and indeed with most of the avant-garde poets and artists of the period. Turning away from scholarly or prescriptive ideas about what poetry or art should be, their work was not informed by established norms, but catalyzed by the casual sense of friendship and collaboration they found in each other, inspiring each other to create new modes of art and push conventional boundaries. In brief, much of the art of the post-war period was created in close-knit experimental circles of artists working in an array of media and largely clustered around a few different locales, including New York, San Francisco, and Black Mountain College. And it's in this milieu that we can locate both Robert Creeley and Robert Indiana. Robert Creeley, a native of Arlington, Massachusetts, was a poet and teacher at Black Mountain College, which was an experimental art school founded in 1933 and became notorious as an interdisciplinary hub. Creeley had struck up a correspondence with an elder poet named Charles Olson, who was teaching at the school and who invited Creeley to join. Though perhaps not widely known, Black Mountain College was a driving force in the 20th century art world and counted among its faculty some of the most influential artists of the time, including Charles Olson and Robert Creeley working in poetry, Willem and Elaine de Kooning, Joseph Albers, Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, and Franz Klein, who were all visual artists, John Cage, working in music, and Merce Cunningham, who was working in modern dance. It was at Black Mountain that Creeley witnessed firsthand the benefit of artistic collaboration. It was the type of place where Merce Cunningham would stage a dance, for which Cage would compose the score, and Rauschenberg would create the sets. And Creeley, during his time at Black Mountain, became the editor of the Black Mountain Review, which was a small journal that featured both upcoming poets and artists' work, combining text and images in interesting ways. And it was this journal, as such, that likely paved the way for and partially inspired the sort of poet-artist collaborations he would go on to produce. Indeed, Creeley's collaborative books with visual artists would become something of a calling card. He completed them at a distance, corresponding with the visual artists via phone and letter. I've included a few of his important collaborative artist books here just to offer a brief taste of the types of works that he created. We have first The Immoral Proposition from 1954, which he created with the French artist René Loby. We have Numbers, of course, from 1968 with Robert Indiana, the American painter and printmaker. A Daybook from 1971 with R.B. Katai, a London-based artist. The Class of 47 from 1973 with Joe Bernard, an American artist known for his drawings. And Presences from 1976 with Marisol, a Venezuelan-American artist known for her sculpture. Just as Creeley had a formative experience at Black Mountain College, where he saw firsthand the value and excitement of artistic collaboration, Robert Indiana was, around the same time, enmeshed in his own artistic and collaborative community. Along with several influential artists like Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, Jack Youngerman, and James Rosenquist, Indiana lived in what is now Manhattan's financial district in the Coenty Slip area. Briefly, the Coenty Slip area was originally built as a commercial waterway to support trade, but even after the waterway was eventually filled, it retained its industrial roots and was full of old, abandoned sailing and commercial lofts. Young artists like Indiana flocked to the slip and rented out these cheap lots, turning them into artist studios. And because they were abandoned lofts, they were often filled with found material, particularly things like shipping stencils and crates that would become a signature feature of some of the artists' works, including Indiana's. So we can see, I think, pretty clearly in Indiana's work that there is a lot of sort of stencil work involved. And again, that was sort of motivated by the fact that there were these shipping stencils that were left behind. And it's sort of become a signature of Indiana's work to see this very stencil-like writing and a combination of text and images in them. Just as Creeley displayed early interest in other artistic mediums and was especially enamored with visual art, Indiana himself had an early interest in poetry. In fact, as a young man, before he became a visual artist, Robert Indiana wrote several poems himself. And I'll just say here that it's a good thing he discovered art because he was a rather bad poet. Nonetheless, the early interest in poetry clearly impacted the way he approached art, which was notable because it often included words and language, especially in an age of formalism where that was sort of not the norm. This really sort of seemed to push boundaries. At a time when critics were arguing that the discipline should be strictly divided, we see the opposite in Indiana's work. We can see instead in Indiana's work the primacy of language and its interplay with visual elements. This is, of course, readily identifiable in Indiana's most famous work, Love, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which he says conveys his, quote, visual verbal idea, meaning that the print can and should be seen both as a word and an image at once, a kind of visual verbal compaction. He has also and similarly referred to Love as a concrete poem, which is again a type of poetry that's meant to be seen and read simultaneously. But we can also see this importance of language in other crucial works of his, like the Eat, Die diptych from 1962 and the American Dream series, where he's sort of playing with language and numbers. Indeed, sort of stencils, language, numbers, these are all signatures of Indiana's work. Clearly, given Indiana's interest in poetry and visual art, and Creeley's corresponding interest in the interaction between these media and in collaborating with visual artists, they were well positioned to create the numbers collaboration that they'd soon produce. Importantly for Numbers, however, it was not a collaboration that the artists came to themselves. Numbers was actually engineered by a young artist named Bill Katz, who worked as Robert Indiana's assistant in his studio. It was Katz who was responsible for sending Indiana's series of number prints to Creeley and asking him to write poems for them. And it was Katz who was primarily in charge of creating the book in conjunction with its German publisher, Domberger, who Katz happened to randomly meet on an airplane. And it was Katz who mostly corresponded and served as an intermediary between the two, speaking frequently with Creeley via letters and telephone calls. And clearly he found a long-standing sort of correspondence and friendship. Creeley found a long-standing correspondence and friendship with Katz and Indiana both. In his archives at Stanford University, we have dozens of letters and postcards between the three of them, two of which are here. We see Creeley on the left-hand side had sent his poem Zero with a little note attached to Katz and Indiana, and then we see a long letter from Katz to Creeley. So he was really sort of the person in charge of this book and creating it, and they became lifelong friends. But one of the most remarkable things I found while researching this book was a recorded phone conversation between Katz and Creeley, where Katz describes receiving the first edition of Numbers for the first time. And so I want to play just a small part of that for you, both because I think it's just really fascinating to hear Creeley and Katz speaking in 1968, and because I think it tells us a few important things about Numbers. So I'll play that for you with the caveat that the phone quality is decent for a 1978 phone call, but a little bit fuzzy. Let's see.
Well, I'll tell you one thing's happy. This summer I got, we went to Mexico. I think I wrote you that I finished the book, and
yes,
that's terrific. And Numbers sits like right in, well, no, it's right in the center. So I'm feeling very good.
Robert, if you have like a Xerox or something.
I'll try to get you a copy of the manuscript. The thing is not going to be published until next fall.
But I'd love to read what you have.
Yeah, I'll give you the whole form of it, because frankly, the means of writing that sequence got to is really what I was frankly looking for, something that didn't have to continue in the usual thematic or, you know, the developed thought business. And that sequence broke that.
I read it again now that it's published like this, and I don't want to say anything, but I think it happens to be one of the extraordinary things that I've ever read.
It really helped me extremely. I mean, I'll sweep your floors and everything.
No, it really is. And in German, he did such a beautiful thing. I mean,
yeah, I was very, very
I think,
pleased.
yes, Mr. Domberger really did a beautiful thing. I mean, I was shocked to see it boom there, but we had lost contact. You know, I would write, he would write, and he was busy. But what it came out is it's a little thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's 10 by 8.5. It's not so little. That's why it's.
But it's a lovely.
And it's bound in a cardboard, and it looks like it has a piece of brown wrapping paper.
I love that, don't you?
Yeah.
Boy.
And the first thing that Andy Brown said was, "What a gorgeous idea."
Yeah.
And it says, it has a little stencil at the bottom. It says Numbers, and the top in heavier letters with small type. It says Robert Creeley, Robert Indiana.
Oh, lovely. Oh. Yeah.
And inside, all the poems are printed, one to a page, first in English, in black, and then in German red,
that's beautiful.
on the next page. And on this kind of, it looks like it's cheap, but if you look at it, it's not cheap. It's just,
I know what you.
Just kind of an off-brown kind of.
No, they're impeccable, I think.
Vein line paper, and it's just gorgeous. And then the number, boom,
Wow.
box it to you, and it's just gorgeous.
Just wow.
It's just really gorgeous.
Well, that's great. Well, that's a deep pleasure.
Just beautiful.
All right. So you can clearly hear Katz's enthusiasm, I think, for the book. But two important things, I think, emerge out of this phone conversation between Katz and Creeley. The first is that we hear Creeley, hopefully we could hear Creeley, I know it's a little blurry, but we hear Creeley describe that he has finished his recent manuscript, which would become his 1969 volume Pieces, in which he includes the numbers poems he wrote for the collaboration after being inspired by Indiana's Prince. He notes, in fact, that the sequence sits right at the middle of the forthcoming volume. But what he notes about it specifically, and this is crucial, is that writing the sequence of numbers poems occasioned a fundamental shift in his understanding of what verse might accomplish. The sequence, in other words, led to a foundational shift in Creeley's poetic career as he begins to move away from a more sort of lyric form of poetry, or what he calls, quote, the developed thought business, into a more serial, open form of poetry where one thing leads to another that would become a hallmark of his work. And this, I think, really speaks to how important these collaborations were for him and for other poets in pioneering new forms of verse and spearheading innovation. The second thing that comes out of the recording is that Katz gives Creeley and us some insight into how the book is laid out. He discusses how it looks like it's finished in brown wrapping paper and looks cheap, but isn't. This, I think, is a crucial insight into what Creeley, Katz, and Indiana are trying to accomplish in numbers more broadly. His description, that is, lays out what I perceive to be a fundamental premise of the book: to take something pedestrian or simple, like brown wrapping paper or like a mere number, and to elevate it into something else, something that has new dimension. He also discusses the interior sequence. For each number, 0 to 9, that's included, the book follows a distinctive pattern. First, we encounter Creeley's poem in English, printed in black ink, and I've sort of laid this out, the successive pages. Then that's followed by a translation of the same poem in German, because the publisher was German, in red ink. And finally, we see the Indiana print with its own unique color scheme. As Katz says, boom, socks it to you. There's an important repetitiveness here where we essentially encounter 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, or 7, 7, 7.
Well, I'll tell you one thing.
Don't want to replay that. Let's go back. And here's why I think that repetitiveness is important. Earlier, I had mentioned that one of my central arguments is that something changes when we view poems in the artist book context versus how we view them in the collected works. Here we see that play out in Creeley's work too. On the left is an image of how the same numbers poems were reprinted in the collective works of Robert Creeley. And what we see in the collected works is that the numbers poems move in succession. 7 is followed by 8, is followed by 9, and so on. That's not quite what we encounter in the original artist's book. Of course, the numbers still follow each other there, but what we get in the artist's book is a much more present sense of echo and redundancy. Rather than 7, 8, 9, or linear movement from one number to the next, we get a sense of circularity, 7, 7, 7. Each number becomes like a little circuit in its own right. That, in turn, lends the poetry and art a very distinctive pace or rhythm that isn't quite the same as in a list. And that was something that Creeley himself picked up on that he and Katz were trying to accomplish. And this circularity or redundancy also prompts us to a different mode of response. Rather than just reading the numbers and moving on, as we're perhaps accustomed to when we're counting, we're asked instead to dwell a bit more deeply on the meaning or significance of each number. Because we are asked to dwell on them for longer, we are afforded more time and space to think about the resonance that each number might have, for Creeley, for Indiana, and perhaps ultimately for us too. In the artist's book, Creeley and Indiana ask us to really sit with the numbers, to stay in their presence. And so on that note, I thought it would be appropriate that we do the same, dwelling in the presence of these poems for a moment, and then we'll return to them afterwards. But I'd like to pause here for a reading of Creeley's poems by inviting up our wonderful performer today, Jazmin. Go ahead and start.
1. What singular upright flourishing condition? It enters here, it returns here. Who was I that thought it was another one by itself, divided or multiplied, produces one. This time, this place, this one. You are not me, nor I you, always. As of a stick, stone, something so fixed it has a head, walks, talks, leads a life. 2. When they were first made, all the earth must have been their reflected bodies for a moment, a flood of seeming bent for a moment back to the waters glimmering. How lovely they came. What you wanted, I felt, or felt I felt. This was more than one. This point of so-called consciousness is forever a word making up this world of more or less than it is. Don't leave me. Love me, one by one. As if to sit by me were another who did sit. So, to make you mine, in the mind, to know you. 3. They come now with one in the middle, either side thus another. Do they know who each other is, or simply walk with this pivot between them? Here forms have possibility. When either this or that becomes choice, this fact of things enters. What had been agreed now alters to two and one, always. The first triangle of form of people sounded a lonely occasion, I think. The circle begins here, intangible, yet a birth. Four. This number for me is a comfort, a secure fact of things. The table stands on all fours, the dog walks comfortably, and 2 by 2 is not an army, but friends who love one another. 4 is a square or a peaceful circle, celebrating return, reunion, love's triumph. The card, which is the 4 of hearts, must mean enduring experience of life. What other meaning could it have? Is a door 4, but who enters? Abstract, yes, as 2 and 2 things, 4 things, 1 and 3. 5. 2 by 2, with now another in the middle, or else at the side. From each of the 4 corners, draw a line to the alternate points. Where these intersect will be 5. When younger, this was a number used to count with and to imagine a useful group. Somehow the extra one, what is more than 4, reassured me there would be enough. 2s and 3s, or 1 and 4, is plenty. A way to draw stars. 6. Twisting, as forms of it, 2 and 3. On the 6th day had finished all creation. Hence holy, or that the sun is furthest from, equator, and appears to pause before returning. Or that it contains the first even number 2, and the first odd, number 3, the former representing the male member, and the latter the molarbus pudenda, or 2 triangles interlocked. 7. We are 7, echoes in my head like a nightmare of responsibility, 7 days in the week, 7 years for the itch of unequivocal involvement. Look at the light of this hour. I was born at 7 in the morning, and my father had a monument of stone, a pillar, put at the entrance of the hospital of which he was head. At 6s and 7s, the pen lost the paper. A night's dead drunkenness. Why, the death of something now, so near, if this number is holy, all are. Number 1 is counting forever, beginning again. Let this be the end of the 7. 8. Say 8. Be patient. 2 4s show the way. Only this number marks the cycle. In the 8-year interval for that confluence, makes the full moon shine on the longest or shortest day of the year. Now summer fades. August, its month, this interval. She is 8 years old, holding a kitten, and looks out at me. Where are you? 1 table, 1 chair. In light lines, count the interval. 8 makes the time wait quietly. No going back, though half is 4 and half again is 2. Oct, on, ag, on, all. 9. There is no point of rest here. It wavers. It reflects multiply the 3 times 3. Like a mirror, it returns here by being there. Perhaps the emphasis implicit, over and over, triads of triads, triply scared and perfect number, that resolves what? In the shifting, fading containment? Somehow the game, where a nutshell covers the one object, a stone or coin, and the hand is quicker than the eye. How is that 9 and not 3 chances, except that 3 imaginations of it might be, and there are 2 who play, making 6, but the world is real also in itself. More, the 9 months of waiting that discover life or death. Another life or death. Not yours, not mine, as we watch. The serial diminishment or progression of the products which help me remember. 9 times 2 is 1 8. 9 times 9 is 8 1 at each end. Move forward, backward, then at the same numbers will occur. What law or mystery is involved protects itself. 0. Where are you? Who, by not being here, are here, but here by not being here. There's no trick to reality. A mind makes it any mind. You walk the years in a nothing, a no place I know as well as the last breath. I took, blowing the smoke out of my mouth, will also go nowhere, having found its way. Reading that primitive systems seems to have natural cause for the return to 1 after 10. But this is not 10. Out of nothing, 1 to return to that. Americans have a funny way, of somebody wrote a poem about it, of doing nothing. What else can they do? What, by being not, is not by being. When bowls taste good, we'll put them in our bread.
Thank you, Jazmin, for that beautiful performance. I want to return us to the artist's book now to talk briefly about one of the poems, number 8. As Bill Katz once described, Creeley's number poems, quote, become present as something that exists in a real, sudden way. And the most arresting of Creeley's poems certainly live up to Katz's description, with 7 and 8 offering particularly clear examples, though we'll only focus on the latter today. Both 7 and 8 are at heart elegies, or poems of lament for the dead. And accordingly, as the poems proceed, we witness 7 and 8 morph from mere numbers into poignant reminders of death. Let's look in particular at 8. Like the other number poems in the series, 8 is full of shifts, moving between the different associations that the number provokes. Creeley himself once described the way he wrote his poems, noting that he would begin by looking up texts of numbers and getting some information that way, but soon shifted instead to thinking about what personal resonance each number held, finding the other information, quote, too scholastic and scholarly in tone. And this juxtaposition between impersonal or academic information and personal resonance equally informs 8. The poem begins, as many Creeley's number poems do, by breaking down the number into its constituent parts. 2 4s show the way. Next, Creeley draws on other distant associations with a number, and in the process reveals the utility of numbers for measuring time. He starts by counting years, denoting the 8-year interval, or octoteris, which refers to the way lunar cycles repeat every 8 years. Then he brings us down to the scale of months, drawing the association between 8 and August. It is here, however, that the poem shifts dramatically, suddenly offering a very specific, imploring image of an 8-year-old girl holding a kitten, looking at him, before wondering, "Where are you? One table, one chair." While the lines at first suggest an intense presence, eliciting the little girl in question, they quickly devolve into intense absence as Creeley implores, "Where are you?" and laments the emptiness of one table, one chair. Here, the poem switches into an intensely personal mode, and what emerges is a memory and an elegy. In 1961, roughly 7 years before he was working on numbers, Creeley's 8-year-old stepdaughter, Leslie, had died in a freak accident after being buried under a collapsing sandbank. It becomes clear then that Creeley's association with the number 8 is a painful one. We suddenly become alert to the despairing tone of, "Where are you?" a question in which Creeley seems to speak directly to Leslie. 8 is a poem both of remembrance and loss. This, in turn, further shifts the poem's relationship to time. The passage of time here becomes associated with grief and the way it endures, even after months and years. When the poem continues, "In light lines count the interval," Creeley appears to reflect on the passage of time since Leslie's death, reminding us not only of grief's stunning endurance, but of death's cruel finality, no going back. The final octagonal deals the last blow. Here, a word that might otherwise denote a simple shape becomes a wrenching expression of Creeley's grief. In breaking down the word, he literally seems to pull apart space and time, asking us to reside more fully in it. First, we stop at oct, the prefix for 8, but also for October, the month when Leslie's death occurred. Then the central agon, struggle, trial, the root of agony. Octagonal here is not merely a word to describe an 8-sided figure, but becomes a means of conveying grief's painstaking intervals, its many breaks and gaps. The poem draws readers into the extended time of Creeley's grief, and perhaps empathetically, our own. That a poem about a number could be so deeply moving is perhaps surprising. Creeley enables us to see the personal resonance that we can associate with numbers. But for attentive viewers of Robert Indiana's own work, this personal resonance should come as no surprise. For in Indiana's paintings, too, we locate a sense of elegy or of personal resonance. In fact, it was likely the personal, affective quality of Indiana's prints that initially prompted Creeley to respond in kind in his own poems. As the Indiana scholar Susan Ryan tells us, only Creeley and a few other astute observers have been able to recognize in Indiana's prints a real duality, the way they juxtapose impersonal pattern forms and a submerged network of personal memories and experiences. What Creeley must have noted in Indiana's prints, in other words, is precisely the same thing he elicits in his own work, a striking dichotomy between the personal and the impersonal, the sense that a number can be both an abstract thing, a mere sign, and also an intimate occasion. Indeed, if we look more closely at Indiana's 8, we see both the impersonal and personal at play. On the one hand, the 8, done in a bold color, here red, encircled with the number spelled out below, is very template-like. Besides the specific color choice, Indiana's screen print of 8 looks pretty much exactly like his screen print of 1 or 2 or 7 or 9. This sense of template, or the repeated imagery, is why he's often associated with pop art. We can think, by way of example, of Andy Warhol's repeated soup cans or images of Marilyn Monroe. It feels like there's nothing much beyond the surface. 8 is 8. A soup can is a soup can. It's just an object. And yet conflating Indiana with pop art so easily is not quite right. For while pop artists like Warhol were quite invested in the idea of depersonalizing art, Indiana is not. Throughout his body of work, Indiana's screen prints often have quite striking personal associations. For instance, throughout his work, he routinely associates the number 6 with his father, who worked for Phillips 66, and he associates 8 in particular with his mother, Carmen. This is because, as Indiana himself has relayed, eat was the last word that my mother said before she died. He associates 8 with his mother then because he uses the number 8 as a homonym for the word ate, or the past tense of eat. He does this most famously in his 1962 diptych, Eat, Die, which is a clear tribute to his mother, denoting her last words, and then her death. And notice, too, that the colors he uses in that diptych are very similar to the ones he draws on in the print: red, black, brown. And not only does he associate the word eat and then ate with his mother, but also the color red, which we also see in his 1963 print, A Mother is a Mother. If we consider the 3 pieces together, then, we can begin to see how the 8 print, which initially seems like nothing more than a template, might actually be imbued with much deeper meaning and association, if we're attentive to the patterns that frequently play out in Indiana's work. In the same way that Creeley's poem 8 becomes an elegy for his stepdaughter Leslie, Indiana's print of 8 becomes an elegy for his mother. Or perhaps more accurately, as the Indiana scholar Susan Ryan describes, we can see Indiana's number prints as portraits, images that bespeak real people and real memories. And if we look at the numbers suite more fully, we see other examples of this same sort of thing. For instance, if we look briefly at 2, we can see a primary blue and green color palette. Notably, the shades of blue and green were signature colors of the painter Ellsworth Kelly, who is Indiana's sometime lover. And Indiana has said on record that he associates the number 2 with love. These connections are, in other words, no accident, and the effect should not be overlooked. As Robert Creeley himself once said of Indiana's prints, with an Indiana number, it's like someone's particular number, and the artist gives an extraordinarily emotional feel that he can make manifest in, say, number 2. So what I'd like to suggest in closing is that Creeley's poems and Indiana's prints ultimately work in much the same way. Both Indiana and Creeley work to show us how numbers can purport an extraordinarily emotional feel, even when they initially look or seem unassuming. Moreover, there is a unique emotional intensity that we get in the artist's book because of its specific combination of both the poems and prints. And it's this emotional intensity that risks getting lost, I think, when we only see the poems without the prints and vice versa. After all, it was Creeley's ability to notice this deeply emotional quality in Indiana's prints that led him to respond with extraordinary emotional poems in kind. But the effect works both ways. For when we encounter Creeley's poems in the artist's book form, and when we're invited to dwell in them, to dwell in the numbers, we're then primed to see something more in Indiana's prints too. In short, when the poems and prints are placed together in the artist's book form, rather than separated out, Creeley's poems enable us to better and more fully perceive the tenderness in Indiana's prints. And Indiana's prints, in turn, allow us to better and more fully understand the emotional impetus behind Creeley's poems. To view these poems and prints in the collaborative artist book context is to come away with a rather distinct, and I'd argue more enriching experience of the poems and prints themselves. We leave the collaborative artist book more secure in the belief that numbers can indeed be much more than rote entities. After all, numbers take measures of our lives, reminding us not just of the memories, associations, and experiences that are uniquely our own, but the ones that we share with others, like grief, or indeed, like love. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. If you would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A mic right here. And if you would like me to bring the mic up to you, you can just raise your hand.
And if you don't want to ask any questions,
Yeah, I'll ask a question.
that's good too. Oh.
Hi, I'm a painter and writer, and those meanings that you describe in the symbols are really hidden from most viewers. I never knew this,
Yeah.
and they're not at all explicit in the works themselves. So in a way that bothers me. I could go on, but because the actual works don't express those kind of things to me unless I know the background.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. But I think even if we don't know that, I think there's something about asking us to sort of sit with and repeat the number 888. Even if we don't know what Creeley would have said about it, well, we know what Creeley would have said about it, but if we don't know what Indiana would have said about it, I think it opens up space for us to think, too, about our own associations, right? What do we associate with the number 8? Creeley obviously associates his stepdaughter with the number 8, but what does it mean for us? Is it a favorite number? Is it our birthday, right? So I think as much as it is helpful to know that background, and I do think we can learn a lot from knowing that background, I think it's just as important that there is space for us to think about how we feel about these numbers as well.
I'll just pass it around. How about that?
Thank you for that, and it was great to hear the poems. And as I heard them, I kept thinking, words and images are so different from each other in the way that our brains respond to them. You know, the words were very emotional sometimes in the Creeley, and then I thought, okay, emotion in the images is color. But it's a very different way of getting at emotion than the verbal one. And, you know, with the limits of time that you haven't said a whole lot about the differences between image and word in these artists' books. But if you have any brief thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said it well. But I think they are very different in terms of the emotional valence, in terms of, obviously, images, color being a primary vehicle. I think for emotion, red seems to be one of emotional intensity, for instance. Yeah, I think I'd have to think a little bit more about that. Yeah, I mean, I think they ask for different forms of attention. Obviously, they ask for different emotional resonance, but yeah, I think I'd have to think a little bit more about that difference more fully. I haven't, fully thought about that. I mean, I have, but nothing's coming to me at this moment exactly.
There's a push and pull, and I mean, I thought compared to the images, the Creeley was busy, you know, and you know that the two forms, they can have a dialectic or compete even. Yeah. You know, did you find that in your study of artist books? Is there a way in which there's a lively tension between image and word?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it depends on the book a little bit, because certain books, I think, have words and images more in tension than others. In this one, I see some tension, but I feel like they're working more in harmony than in some of the other books that I looked at. Like, for instance, the Frank O'Hara book of odes that I started with the Michael Goldberg print, I see those in more tension, in part because they're abstract prints, and so there's not that sort of direct relationship between 8 and 8. And I think there's sort of almost competition on the page itself, where we are sort of looking through, I don't know if I can pull it up, but looking through the image all the way back at the beginning, looking through the painting to see the words. And so that one to me feels like, I overshot a little bit. That one to me feels like they're more potentially in tension than I find in Creeley and Indiana's work, where it's almost like there's a physical match between the poems and images on the page, where the painting is sort of obscuring the words. And even as it sort of brings out dimension to the poem, there's also a tension there, I think, in that particular book. And also similarly in the book Concordance with maybe Bursenberg and Kiki Smith, we see a similar thing where they're a little more in tension. But to me, as much as the poems and prints might compete with each other in Indiana, to me it feels more harmonious than not, because of that sense of echo and sort of 8, 8, 8 that I find.
I have a question about the colors.
Yes.
So if you put the colors back up of,
I'm getting
Keep
to them.
going.
They're just all the
I'm
way at
waiting.
the end.
because I can't remember them all, I need
Yeah.
it.
They're all primarily,
I know,
mostly
but-
primary colors.
Okay, but in the
Yeah.
number 8, no, in the number 8, it's on a black background, and when I was looking at it, it looked like it was almost ringed in purple. And black and purple are both, in my culture, funereal colors. But the use of black in the number 4 is much more upbeat. The purple, it's just, it looks happier.
Yeah.
The 4 looks happier than the 8. So my question is, and I might have missed this part.
Yeah.
What came first, the chicken or the egg? The print or the poem?
The prints.
Print came first.
The prints came first, and then Katz sent the prints to Creeley to write the poems. But also, would so the colors he chose, actually, Robert Indiana has said, and you're perceptive to pick up on this, he has said that 1 through 0 represent also life stages in his own kind of numerology. So he says 1 represents birth. I'm not exactly sure why, but something about the red seems to elicit birth for him. And he says that the 0, which I can understand a little more fully, suggests death. And so what we see, and he said 8 and 9 are sort of autumnal colors, so they're sort of end-of-life colors. So I think the 4 versus the 8, the difference in the black is 4 is sort of like middle years, and 8 and 9 are sort of later years of life. And so that's what he has said he associates life, or these colors with, but also then there's very particular resonances, like the 8 with his mother, that's throughout his oeuvre. Red is always associated with his mother. The 6 for his father is meant to represent the colors of the Phillips 66 sign against a blue sky. And so it's sort of twofold, because they both represent life stages, but they also represent some of these more particular associations, like the 2, like the 6, like the 8.
I mean, that's interesting that the print, preceded the poem, but did the title come from Creeley, and is there anything in the correspondence to suggest, numbers in musicians often play that number, that song, and song and poetry go back, a couple of millennia. Yeah. Anything about that in the correspondence? Not that I found. I think Indiana had titled this like the numbers sequence, so I think that was just the number he gave to, or the title he gave to the numbers sequence. And then I think because Robert Creeley was writing the poems based on the prints, they just decided that numbers would be the title. He did have a small chapbook version of the numbers that was reprinted called 5 Numbers and only includes 5 of the poems, but it's always just been called numbers. And I didn't find anything in particular that said why, except that it was very literal. But I will say too, Indiana's titles are often rather literal, right? They tend to just denote what the painting is about. Numbers, or Eat Die is called Eat Die.
Well, thank you, Alexandra, for a wonderful hour. Thank you, Jazmin, for reading the poems and bringing life to the numbers. Thank you all for coming. And just another plug for the Clark Library. We're open to the public Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. You don't need a letter. You don't need a justification. You're all welcome to come in, use our research collection, our reference collection, and look at our artists' books. So we hope to see you soon and often.